Good afternoon. Thank you for coming at this late time in the day on a Sunday after 2 days of conference. It's a bit painful, so I'll try to keep you awake. We're going to talk about accessibility, and before I get started, is there anyone in the audience that has vision issues and would like me to describe my slides? Show of hands. Nobody. All right. Cool. Thank you. So I'm talking about accessibility, and I'm showing a set of stairs, and I'm asking, what if these stairs were accessible? Obviously, I can't use them, but it doesn't mean they're not accessible. There's all kinds of accessibility features built into those stairs. There's a long handrail that doesn't stop, so someone who's vision impaired can actually follow the handrail and know when the level arrives and when the stairs stop, so that's a good visual, good tactile indicator. There is a flat level halfway through the steps, so somebody who has problems going for a long flight of steps can safely take a break. Each steps has a really visible change in level marker, so someone who has low vision can actually see the change in each step. And each risers are actually closed, so someone who doesn't have really good control of their feet, the feet is not going to slide into the steps. So all these things make for an accessible set of stairs for some people. And when we're talking about web accessibility, we have to think a little bit like that. It's incremental and it's iteration. So it's not because you can't make your website accessible for everybody. Someone who's deaf, blind, and paralyzed from the neck down. If you can't do that, then you're just going to say, well, it's too hard, I'm not going to touch it. So think in terms of incremental. Accessibility poor in the Pythonistas. We have obviously a few people interested in Python in this room, unless you're in the wrong conference. But yeah, and accessibility, it's quite important. It's not quite obvious at first for, if you write code that accessibility is important, but we'll get to that point. Who am I? I'm Nick. I've been doing accessibility for nearly 22 years now. I currently work with Nobility, which is a nonprofit based in the United States. And the mission of Nobility is to make sure that people with disabilities, whether youth or adults, have access to information, access to the web, and access to all that aspect of life, which is really, in this day and age, something that is so intrinsic into everything we do. So you may have noticed I have a dog that goes with me, and about a year ago, I was on Sainte Catherine, and I heard two ladies that were at a terrace, and one said to the other, "Isn't it sad? The poor man, he's blind and in a wheelchair." Because, of course, I had a dog, and not everybody knows that service dogs come in many flavors. You can have dogs that help with hearing, dogs that help with seeing, and dogs that help with mobility. The thing is, you don't know that you don't know. And it's something to acknowledge for me as an expert in accessibility, but also for you that are doing accessibility. Your level of knowledge may be very strong or not so much, but you don't necessarily realize that there are things you don't know about. That's okay. We're going to build that knowledge. So what's accessibility? It's the inclusive practice of building websites that are usable by everyone, regardless of level of ability or disability. So that's my definition. There's about 2 bazillion definitions out there. I do a podcast about accessibility, and every single guest I have defines accessibility differently, which is really fun. But the basics of it is we want to make sure that what we build functions for people with disabilities and for people that don't have a disability. How does that affect you when you program in Python? It affects you the moment you start building something that has a front-end component that people are going to interact with it. So if you build code to try to get your machines go better or gather data from whatever system, it's not quite as important. But the moment you have a front-facing form for sign up of a newsletter or whatever, it becomes really important that you have accessibility built in. Who's accessibility for? We're looking at people that have hearing impairments, so people who are deaf or hard of hearing. We're talking about people who have vision impairments, someone who's blind or has low vision. We're talking about people that have mobility impairments, so wheelchair user or someone who's got even mild cerebral palsy. They might have shake and problem using a mouse. We're talking about people with cognitive disabilities. It might be dyslexia. There's a huge number of people that have dyslexia. It might be someone that played hockey as a teenager and got hit once too many times, and they have some kind of cognitive load going on because of brain injury. So there's a wide range of things, and perhaps one of the big myths out there about accessibility is it's only for people who are blind. And yeah, sure, people who are blind, screen reader users, have a big problem with accessibility, but it's also reaching out for a lot of people. We're talking about accessibility on all devices: desktop, laptop, tablets, phone, braille readers. Some people that are blind have it's a handheld device that doesn't have a screen. It may have an audio output, and it may have braille output. So things need to work for all the devices like that. We're going to talk a little bit about assistive technology, and just so we know what that is, we're talking about screen readers. So that's software that does what the name says. It reads what's on the screen, but it does much more than that. It allows to interact with all aspects of the computer, whether it's navigating file folder, opening applications, closing applications, creating files, all that time. We're talking about keyboard, probably one of the biggest assistive technology out there. The keyboard is fantastic. It was invented in the 1850s, and the most widely accepted reason of creating the keyboard was a guy was a director of a school for deaf people, and he wanted the kids that were deaf to be able to write as fast as other people, and the keyboard saw the day. We're talking about Dragon Naturally Speaking. You may have heard this motto of it, you talk, it types. It does, like screen reader, a lot more than that. It's what we call a command and control. So with Dragon, you can navigate the web, you can open apps, you can create files, if the site is coded properly, of course. We're talking about sip and puff switches. Show of hand of who does not know what a sip and puff switch is. Right, so a sip and puff switch is a really, really cool thing. It looks like a straw. It's usually used by people who are paralyzed fairly high up. And depending on how you sip or puff into the straw, the patterns, it will be able to dictate what the computer is going to do. So you can determine, tell your wheelchair to go fast or slow, turn right, turn left, or you can say open Safari, go to this page, and then tab and interact with that. I met an amazing woman a few years ago. She was paralyzed from the neck down, and she crossed the Atlantic solo on a sailboat using sip and puff technology. So technology is really amazing. We're talking about eye gaze technology, so you have a camera on your laptop that actually follows where you look, and depending on how you blink, it can activate links, buttons, etc., etc. So there's a lot of stuff out there. Now, there's about 20% of people throughout the Western world that have disability. That's 1 in 5. That's a lot of people. We're talking millions. Let's not forget us. We're talking also about temporary impairments. So it's not just someone who's in a wheelchair. It may be someone who, like me, went and broke both his wrists last year. And I'll have to tell you, I type 80 words a minute normally, and with those 2 casts, I was barely hunting and pecking because I had to really twist myself in different positions to make that. So There's a lot of people that will have temporary impairments or even situational impairments. If you're dealing with a screaming toddler that you have to hold in one hand, trying to look at something on your phone at the same time, I got to tell you, you have a situational impairment. So you want your site to be accessible for these people. Now, one of the things people say a lot is, Nick, accessibility is so difficult. It's such a chore. And I really can't be bothered. And normally when I'm talking to coders, I say, hey, you like a coding challenge, don't you? And most of them say, oh yeah, I love a good puzzle. Think about accessibility that way. Accessibility really is just that. It's a technical challenge, and you can overcome it if you're having problems with it. Now, there's a whole range of requirements, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But following the rules does not necessarily mean that you're going to have an accessible site. So you have to kind of quality test as you go. That photo was taken in Chicago last year. The curb cut is 100% accurate. It's got the right slope, it's got the right width, it's got tactile markers at the bottom, it's got little sides so the wheelchair can't go off it. It's perfect, but you know, it met the requirement, but is it usable for a wheelchair user? No. Is it usable for someone who's blind? It's not usable either. So we have to keep questioning ourselves as we go through. I talked about situational impairments. Barriers on the web is not just for people with disabilities. If you're looking at a site on a mobile phone outside in bright sunlight, you're going to swear at the designer that thought that gray text on gray background was a good idea. If you're building a site and you use plain English to write the text, people that have dyslexia and cognitive learning disabilities will thank you, but someone who's a non-native English speaker is going to thank you, and Google Translate is going to thank you because it's going to be easier to translate. So there's a whole range of things that can be done for accessibility that benefit everyone. So who's responsible for implementing accessibility? Obviously, I would say the majority of us in here are coders, but we also have the designer. We have to start thinking about accessibility from the earliest stage of development. So we have developers, we have the testers, we have the boss, because if the boss doesn't buy into it, then it doesn't matter how much effort you want to put into it if you don't have the resources. It's difficult. We have other stakeholders. I'm fond of saying that the user, the person who visits your site, is responsible for accessibility on your site as well, because if we find a problem, it's up to us to actually say, hey mate, it doesn't work well, help me use your site. And basically everybody. So who's heard of WCAG or WCAG? We have a few people. All right, that's good. Congratulations. WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's a very important set of guidelines to know about. It's in version 2.0 at the moment, and the W3C is finalizing the 2.1 release, which adds about 16 or 21 regulations. Now, WCAG is 3 levels. We're talking about level A, level AA, and level AAA. These levels determine the guidelines that you have to follow to reach a certain level of accessibility. We're talking about 4 principles, and I'll mention those in a little bit. We're talking about 12 rules. We're talking about 61 success criteria and a bazillion different techniques. If you were to print all of WCAG and associated technical documents, you would have a stack about this thick. It's impossible for anyone to know it all by heart. Just remember, it's there and you can refer to it. Now we're talking about POUR, which are the 4 principles. We're talking about perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. This is my t-shirt. So perceivable, the information in the user interface can be presented in a way that can be perceived to everyone. So someone who's using a screen reader, someone who's using drag and dictate, someone who's using a mobile phone. So you want to have that information perceivable. Operable, well, you have to be able to handle all the operations, all the functions of the site, regardless of how you get there. And that may be as simple as trying to use your keyboard to navigate a site. I'll have a challenge for you on that a little bit later. Understandable, well, you have to be able to understand the information. And one thing that's fairly typical, actually, I just finished an accessibility audit, and the client had done about 50% of their content as images of text in JPEGs, which is not very user-friendly for screen readers. It's also not very friendly at all for Google search engines who try to index your text. Because if it's all an image of text, I'm sorry, but AI at this point is not quite advanced enough to be able to understand that. Finally, robust, we have to make sure that our site work for all user agents, including assistive technologies. So what does that mean concretely? We're talking about keyboard navigation. You have to be able to use all the site with the keyboard only. And you have to have no keyboard traps. One of the things that happens sometimes is you can go forward on a site and then you want to go backwards and suddenly you can't move backwards using the keyboard only. We're talking about screen readers. The way people using screen readers interact with a website is through the keyboard, so it has to work for that. And it's not only about moving around the page, but it's also being able to see where you're at on a page. So if you have a sighted keyboard-only user and you have no focus styles defined on your links or your buttons, someone can tab through and they won't know where they are, and that's not very useful. So you have to be careful about that. So who here has tested any website, especially your own, using only a keyboard? Oh, good, we have a few people. For everyone else, I would challenge you tomorrow, or at some point this week, to spend an entire day, unplug your mouse, don't use your trackpad, and navigate every website using only a keyboard. And how do you do that? You use the tab key to go forward, or shift tab to go backwards. Use the enter key or the space bar to activate elements. Now, if you're on a Mac, you want to use Option Tab or Option Shift Tab. I challenge you to do that on your favorite websites, and you will start to have an inkling about how bad things are. Keyboard accessibility is one of the easiest thing to do, and it's one of the things that are very often the most problematic. Images, of course, we're talking about people using screen readers, so we need to think about the alt attribute. So when you put in an image, you want to have the alt attribute. Fun fact about the alt attribute, in 1992, the image tag came into HTML, and it was not until 1995 that the alt attribute came in. So for a period of 3 years, there was no way for screen reader users to actually get the information about images. Another fun fact about the alt attribute, Sir Tim Berners-Lee said when it was first proposed that he did not want that. He wanted to use figure captions to deliver that information. And strangely enough, we now have fig caption in HTML5. So the alt attribute, we're talking about putting the image tag, the source, and then the image description in the alt attribute. But sometimes you want to have an empty alt attribute because some images are merely decorative. And if you have an image, say you have a nice tree in a field and there's a cow eating near the tree and all that, and you're just writing about your nice day at the farm, that image is just really decorative. And for someone who's using a screen reader, the description can become really heavy and cumbersome. So you have to make that decision as to, is the image decorative or is it informative? And then if it's informative, you have to think about the right alt text. So context is important. There's link bit.ly alt-decision-tree, which goes to a W3C site that has a really nice graphic, a step-by-step decision as to what do you put for alt text. Really good resource if you're not familiar with creating alt text. The other issue we see a lot of is forms. So forms, we're talking about labels, we're talking about required fields, and we're talking about error notifications. These are probably the three biggest problems we encounter in terms of accessibility. So labels. We have to associate a label with an input field. It's very important because if there's no label, when someone using a screen reader tabs through the form, they're going to get input. That's all they're going to get announced, input. And if you have 5 input one after the other, and you don't know which one it is, you're just going to give up and not be able to complete the form. It's important to use the label tag and associate it properly with the input. Now, when you do that, don't use the name attribute of the input field, because that does not work anymore. It used to work, but now we want to make sure we use the ID. Required fields. I think we're pretty much all familiar with this red asterisk after a field. You know, the problem is a screen reader is not going to announce color, and when it sees an asterisk, the only thing it's going to say is star. So it might be name star. Now, most screen reader users that are on the web a fair bit are able to deduce that the star is actually meaning it's a required field, but we should make it easier to people. There's a lot of ways to do that. People ask me, hey Nick, is this site accessible? And I'm going to say, well, it depends. Is this solution accessible? Well, it depends. And it makes life complicated for a lot of people that are not living and breathing accessibility. Here's my simple solution for that. Write the word required in the label. Now, your designer might say, hey Nick, it doesn't look good. I don't like that. That's okay. You can push back and say, yeah, but it helps people. It helps people who have vision impairments. It helps people who have cognitive impairments because it's actually quite clear that it's required. And if you use a little star and you're outside in bright sunlight on your mobile phone, maybe you're not going to see that little star. So if you see the word required, it's really going to pop at you. The other is on the input itself, use the area required attribute, or you can use the required HTML5 required attribute, and that's going to programmatically tell the screen reader that that field is required. So you're really making sure you're using both belt and braces. Now, error notification. When there's an error detected in the field, we notify the user. It's good practice. It's useful if the error notification actually makes sense rather than, you know, an error has occurred. That's not very useful. I see, am I getting 10:05? Okay, 5 minutes, I'm going to speak faster. Keep in mind, you need to associate the error with the input forms, the input tag. So if there's an error in the email, say there's an error in the email. If you do inline verification, remember that just putting a red border around a field is not going to be announced to a screen reader, so there's methods to go around that. Document structure, make sure you use semantic structure. As a sighted user, we tend to skim the page and get an impression of what's there. Screen reader user can do the same thing by bringing up a list of headings. So it can easily create a hierarchy. So you can have first heading, then second heading, and break it down that way. Don't skip headings, and don't miss headings. So that's important to build a semantic understanding of your page. Links. The links must be comprehensible in and of themselves. And one of the things we see a lot of is read more and click here. Now, it's possible for a screen reader user to actually bring up a list of links and see what's going on with the links. But what happens if the link is click here, but in context it says don't click here, but you only see the click here? Suddenly you've changed the meaning, the destination of the link completely. So make sure that the links you build are making sense when they're read in and of themselves. Talking about color contrast, I've mentioned gray on gray. That's not really good. High contrast, there's a tool that a lot of people with low vision use. Is called high contrast. It's usually in Windows. Chrome has a plugin. Now, can you see the difference between the regular Drupal website on the left and the high contrast Drupal website on the right? Anybody see where the difference is? What's missing? Yeah, the hamburger menu on the top left has disappeared in Windows High Contrast. The impact of that means someone who's using Windows High Contrast does not know there's a menu there, so they can't go forward. Now, I reported that bug and it was fixed within a week, but it's one of these errors that happen that we have to be careful about. Talking about HTML tables, don't use them for layout. I'll repeat that. Don't use HTML table for layout. And in case it's not clear enough, don't use HTML tables for layout. We have tools to do properly, so we use tables for tabular data. Include row headers and ensure that the rows are associated with the headers. It's one of the trickiest things for a screen reader to do is rendering in a linear fashion something that's two-dimensional. I'm not going to spend time on the code. You can grab my slide and look at that. That's a good example as to how to do that. If you want to learn a little bit about accessibility and the words of people that encounter barriers, go to bit.ly/their-own-words. It's fascinating. Somebody started collating people talking about what it meant to be using the web as a person with disability. It's really enlightening. And that's it. A world tour of accessibility in 25 minutes.
If anybody has questions, we have about 2 minutes for questions.
Yes? You mentioned that you have a podcast. Yes, I do have a podcast. It's called Accessibility Rules. It's on Patreon. It's quite easy to find. I'm sorry, I did not understand the question.
Like, how do you test this website?
How do I test websites? There's a variety of tools that can be used. I actually give a workshop that lasts 2 days on testing. But the nutshell is there's a number of automated tools that can test about 30% of issues. The rest needs to be done manually using a variety of techniques, whether it's using the keyboard, a screen reader, color contrast analyzer, code sniffer. So there's a whole range of things that you can do with that. Anybody else?
One more question, or? We're done. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.